Hey guys, Michael here from The Untitled Show, and today I'm going to be doing a bit of a presentation about former President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, also known as Bush 41, Bush Sr., Daddy Bush. This was a presentation that I originally did for school, but I thought it best to put it into video form because I need something to put on the channel. So let's just get right into it before I waste any time. George H.W. Bush, if you didn't know, was the 41st President of the United States. He was born in 1924 and he died in 2018 and is actually the most recent former president to die. He grew up in a very tight-knit, wealthy New England family. The Bush family is a family that has had political entertainment ties in the United States for a very long time. This is an influence that continues to this day. They've spawned governors, 2 presidents, which is a lot of presidents for a family to have, and a whole bunch of other people. Family to George H.W. Bush was not just a word. He said, family is an idea. Family is incredibly important to the Bushes. And, H.W. Bush, he would devote his entire life to this. So he went to a boarding school in Massachusetts to join his brother, and he caught a staph infection in his junior year, which many of his family members would recall retroactively as the making of George H.W. Bush. This was the moment where George became George. George came into his own, and he ended up staying in the hospital for 6 weeks, ended up having to repeat his school year, but came back better than ever, glowed up incredibly, became senior class president, captained his baseball and soccer teams. It was either baseball or basketball, I don't remember. But yeah, he came back stronger than ever after his infection and left high school, graduated high school, to join the Navy after Pearl Harbor. He had an experience there that resulted in the death of 2 of his fellow soldiers. This was in Japan and was another moment that inspired him towards the idea that public service was what he wanted to devote himself to. And once he came back after World War II, he married Barbara Pierce. Well, he met Barbara Pierce, and obviously after they met, they got married. Barbara Pierce would become Barbara Bush and become a very famous, very influential First Lady. Before he began his career in politics, he began a short career in oil, which he was actually moderately successful at before he turned to politics in Texas, not his home state, but we'll get into that later, getting elected to represent them in the House of Representatives in 1966. He became a rising player in the House, something of a rising star, and caught the radar of Richard Nixon, who was president in the late 60s, early 70s, and had to leave for some reason. I'm not sure what happened to him. But Nixon promised Bush a job in his cabinet if he lost another Senate campaign, and he did end up losing another Senate campaign. Never ended up getting into the Senate, but ended up getting several jobs in the Nixon bureaucracy and the Ford administration, including the ambassador to the UN and the ambassador to China and the director of the CIA. All very, not necessarily shadow jobs, but not very public, not very showy job. He ended up getting to the point where he thought that a presidential run would be great for him, so he ran for the nomination of the Republican Party in 1980, but eventually lost that nomination to Ronald Reagan, the former governor of California at the time. Reagan thought that Bush would be a great running mate pick for him, so he ended up running with Reagan in 1980 and ended up winning that election, becoming vice president to Ronald Reagan and beating the incumbent Jimmy Carter, a Democrat. So this was the beginning of the Reagan Revolution, and Bush was a huge part of that. Obviously, he goes through the 2 terms of the Reagan era from 1981 to 1989, dominating that decade. Not only political change for the United States, but throughout the world, but also social, cultural change, economic change. This was a new era for the country, and we were trying to figure out, do we like this guy? Do we not like this guy? Ronald Reagan, how popular is he? George Bush had to convince these people that he not only supported Reagan's policies, but also had something of his own accord that he could give to the American people. He had this image of being weak, not being as strong, as charismatic as Ronald Reagan was, our first celebrity president. Obviously had a career in Hollywood, so that helped him a lot. Here on the slide, I have the cover of a magazine from Newsweek titled "Fighting the Wimp Factor." This was a battle that Bush had to fight, a battle against this image of being weak. But eventually, Ronald Reagan was popular enough where Bush was able to win pretty significantly. The economy was in good shape, and this was looking good for the Republican Party. This was looking very good indeed. But 1992, 4 years later, spoiler alert, Bush lost this election, even though his approval rating rose to 92%, the reasons for which I'll go into later. He faced a very tough challenge from Pat Buchanan, who was representing this new growing conservative wing of the Republican Party. The Republican Party, this is the beginning of the very, very beginning of what we might now call the MAGA movement, or a little earlier than that, the Tea Party movement. This is sort of the genesis of what we might call that. If you ask historians 50 years from now, when was the start of this very conservative right-wing movement growing out of the Republican Party, they might point to 1992. He ended up losing to Governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton. There are a whole bunch of factors that historians go into when they're trying to point to the reasons for Bush's loss. Some blame the fact that the economy had simply been very sluggish. He had broken his promise of no new taxes that he made in 1988. There was criticism from many people that he was unwilling to expand benefits to homeless people. And there was also this perspective of, this guy is another rich guy from New England, right? He doesn't really represent us. He's out of touch. He doesn't really work for everyone because he's one of them, right? And also the campaign of Ross Perot, favorite of many people, but very disliked by a lot of other people, who ran as an independent or a third party, I can't recall. Many people say that his role was that of a spoiler in the 1992 election, taking votes from Bush and eventually handing the election over to Bill Clinton. So yeah, Ross Perot he's the beginning of businessmen in politics. If you look at Ross Perot, he's kind of the first Donald Trump in that way, not from a political standpoint, but from the idea that a businessman has certain qualities that make him good for president, like analytical skills and management skills. Mitt Romney is another great example of this, like your Vivek Ramaswamy's of the 90s. So these are some maps. You can see what went wrong here. Many of the states that went for Bush hopped off the Bush train in order to hand Bill Clinton the election. You see red California in the 1988 election. That's the most recent time that you've seen that before. You see red New Jersey, last time that we've seen that before. The 90s were really the beginning of this idea of New Jersey being a solid Democratic state. You see some of the Midwestern states flipping to Bill Clinton, Illinois, which is now safe blue, Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky. This election wasn't that long ago. It was 30 years ago, but we see a lot of things that seem unbelievable by the standards of now, right? Like, you can't imagine Louisiana voting for a Democrat now. 30 years we're going to be saying the same thing. Maybe Texas goes blue. It might. So major events for the Bush presidency. Many historians, when they'll look at presidents, they'll say that this guy was more of a foreign policy president, this guy was more of a domestic policy president. James K. Polk, for example, you could point to as foreign policy president, while Abraham Lincoln, you could check out, you might know him, he's more of a domestic president. So he was the first president of the 1990s, right? The first president to serve in this post-Cold War era. The crown jewel of the Bush administration was his response to Saddam Hussein, the ruthless dictator of Iraq, his invasion of Kuwait. I have on there a map if you're geographically challenged or anything. What Bush did was he assembled an incredibly wide-reaching alliance to counter Iraq's illegitimate invasion of Kuwait, their southern neighbor, in an operation that he named, or I don't know where the naming credits go. This was named Operation Desert Storm, and I'll get into that a little more. He also led denuclearization efforts with Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union at the time. And this was, at this point, and I believe is still, the greatest denuclearization operation in the history of the world. So that's good too. He invaded Panama to depose their dictator, Manuel Noriega. He wasn't exactly ideological. This wasn't really an ideological tussle, a criminal one. Manuel Noriega had connections to the drug trade in Panama and in the surrounding Central America, South America states. He ended up being replaced with a more moderate leader who I don't know much about. He also confirmed Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court of the United States. He is still there today. He was appointed to replace Thurgood Marshall in a very, very close confirmation vote, 52-48. It was a very controversial confirmation because of sexual assault, sexual misconduct, allegations on the part of Clarence Thomas via the testimony of a woman with whom he worked, Anita Hill. So to get into legislation, these are the big three. Obviously he did more, but these are the most important ones when you're reading a biography of George H.W. Bush from a political standpoint. First, the Americans with Disabilities Act. This was passed in 1990. It banned discrimination against disabled people in all fields of life, employment, public transportation, etc. This is the beginning of anti-ableist legislation. You've seen ramps before, you've seen all kinds of things, pushed open doors, buttons like pushed open doors. This was really the beginning of that. Clean Air Act. The pollution issue became mainstream after the Exxon Valdez oil spill. It was supposed to tighten air pollution regulations and toxic chemical emissions. You can't really imagine a Republican doing this in 2024, let alone promoting it at all. And also the Immigration Act. There's been a ton of immigration acts. This one was supposed to allow for the admission of 700,000 immigrants per year. When we get into the formal and informal powers, because the course that I'm taking looks at the presidency from a constitutional standpoint, he used his formal powers of nominating judges. We talked about Clarence Thomas, who replaced Thurgood Marshall. In the Constitution, that is the president's job. It's also his job to veto legislation. Or rather, he has the right to veto legislation. He did this to the Civil Rights Act of 1990 and 43 other bills throughout his entire presidency. What the bill was supposed to do was it was supposed to make employees have an easier time filing suits against their employers for discrimination. Bush didn't like it. He thought that it would lead to employment quotas, etc. So he ended up vetoing it. He also has the power to make treaties, which he did with Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, which I mentioned before, the largest treaty of its kind to ever exist. Informal powers, it's the president's responsibility to work with the other two branches of the federal government, including the legislative branch. There was a debate between the Democratic side and the Republican side on how to fix the deficit. The Republicans would rather cut spending, while the Democrats would prefer tax increases. But he had a poor relationship with George Mitchell, who was the majority leader in Congress at that time. I forgot which house it was. He was a leader of the Democratic Party, and Bush simply thought that he was too partisan. At a certain point, he was forced to step back on his promise of no new taxes through a compromise, which ended up raising taxes by a good amount. So this was not all of his cabinet, but these really important players. Dan Quayle was his vice president. He was a bridge between this establishment Republican Party that Bush was a part of and the growing conservative wing that I talked about before. He was chosen to appeal to youth, and he was a little-known senator. He didn't have much of a reputation before. He was a bit of a controversial pick. He was also made fun of for simply not being that bright. He had a couple of verbal gaffes. Secretary of State was James Baker. He was Chief of Staff in the Reagan administration. If you're looking at the Bush administration, a lot of the members are holdovers from the Reagan administration because of the policy similarities, etc. And he was a close friend to Bush. Dick Cheney, who you might recognize, was the Secretary of Defense. He was the second choice. Bush's first choice for defense was not confirmed by the Senate. That's one of the few times that that's happened. He was the Chief of Staff for the Ford administration, and, spoiler alert, he would end up being the vice president for George Bush's son, George Bush Jr., in his administration. So when you look at how George H.W. Bush changed the idea of the American presidency during the Gulf War, Bush's skill to build this alliance of countries to oppose this tyrant in Saddam Hussein. You could say that this great skill was the inspiration for the growth of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in the 1990s, in the Bill Clinton administration and beyond. If you look now at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this kind of something of a Cold War between NATO and Russia has its roots in the Gulf War. You can also check out how Bush Jr.'s administration handled the global war on terror, and how, even though it was mostly a unilateral approach, especially when you look at the war in Iraq, the US also had allies in the war on terror. And this is something that continues up until today. So that's the end of my presentation. Leave in the comments what you think of George H.W. Bush, what you think of him as a president. Yeah, see you in the next one.